Welcome to This Should Be a Game, a podcast about adaptive media and filtering 90% of your life experiences through tabletop role-playing games. I'm Satah, I use they, them pronouns. You can find me on Bluesky at posatachips.gaygothvibes.online. You can find my website at gaygothvibes.online. I'm here, I'm 150 years old. I'm teaching a class about my experiences, and my co-host Jess is, of course, one of the young whippersnappers who's learning from me and all my life experiences. Where can people find your youthful energy, Jess?
Besides in the school library frantically studying, you can also find me online as at jessfrom.online on Bluesky, on my website jessfrom.online, or as Jumpgate Games, pretty much anywhere you can get games.
Wonderful. This, of course, is the final episode of a series where we were using the 2015 movie The Martian to make a tabletop role-playing game. We spoke to, in order, Caleb Zane Hewitt, Dusty Hill, and Kendo Smith about various aspects of this movie and what would be fun to gamify about it. And so today we are going to sort of like go over those conversations, synthesize them down into a thing, talk about a few different directions that this game could go, and then we're kind of just going to turn it over to you and see, hey, do you want to make a game about this stuff? You should do that.
We think everybody should make games.
I thought that maybe I'd be able to get away without mentioning it. I'm coming in at a real high bar today. I've been doing some tasks that I found very satisfying and was a little bit hyper focused, and I did manage to pull myself out of the task to come to this recording, but my energy is still in a place, and I thought maybe I would be able to just ride it out, but I do think that I'm coming off in kind of a way.
Let's go.
So I want to acknowledge it. I'm aware, and it's fine, actually, and it's good.
We have liftoff. I'll meet you out there in space.
Yeah. So, where did we leave off?
Yeah, so at the end of the episode with Kendo, where I feel like the game was, if I had to do like a high-level summary, we've got our three factions, the engineers, the space agency, and the spaceship crew. And players have a character in each faction. Play proceeds in a series of phases where you're meeting as each faction. The astronaut, the Matt Damon in all this, the Mark Watney, is the game itself, is an oracle that is feeding us problems that these groups have to try and help with. The game is split up into a series of arcs, which are to some degree sort of countdowns, not necessarily concretely a number of days, but imitating the movie style of like, we have 200 days to this next big event and we have to solve problems. At the end of the three phases, we come together for a big meeting where everybody gets together and you embody one of those characters and you have to reconcile all the individual things you've been doing. There are projects, some concept of projects that individual groups and even individual people are taking on and trying to solve. And there's some detail we talked about with Kendo there, but I won't go there quite yet. The game is working its way towards producing some sort of epilogue where we talk about the legacy of both this project as a whole, which we know is going to succeed and bring the astronaut home, but also the experiences of the individuals within it. And those individuals might be gathering up consequences because everyone has a personal agenda and a faction agenda, as well as the agenda of the bringing the astronaut home as a whole. The agency is focused on politics, engineering. We talked a lot about like overwork and whether you're going to get a divorce. And in order to simulate that and then like track what's going to happen in the epilogue, sliders where you're tracking different things that are important to your faction or to you as like good, neutral, or bad. And so that might be like public relations for the agency, or that might be overtime or work intensity. It might be loyalty for the crew that might need to like mutiny. And you can take negatives on those sliders to fix problems, to help with your projects. And at the end of a given cycle, everything's going to reset to neutral. But if your slider is in a bad, you're going to take a negative tag. You're going to take getting a divorce, going through a divorce, or you're going to take corporate sponsorship was a great idea that you had for the agency, because your budget is in bad, so you have to take corporate sponsorship.
Right.
And those tags are just narrative. We compared them to quiet your scarcities. You can cancel them later by getting one of your things in a good place, but you're having to sort of do this constant push and pull between, we're trying to get the astronaut home on time. The longer they're there, the worse they come back. And you can make personal sacrifices, or you can sacrifice the astronaut's well-being. You can do not as good of a job of bringing them home faster because you want your face on the rocket, or you need to manage PR or anything like that. And we also talked about how good tags can cancel out bad tags. And there was a concept of, for these individual projects, you're rolling dice and trying to get certain numbers, and you can pass them between each other. And there was a lot of like sort of nitty gritty about how that might work that I don't have to get into. But those to me are the mechanics that stand out. Is there anything you feel like I missed that felt important to you from these episodes?
Yeah, one of the things that I think is worth bringing up is that, particularly in the conversation with Caleb, we were very focused on the ideas of legacy, in that like the game is really working towards that epilogue.
Yes. Like
that is a really big part of it, is how this is documented really matters, and that is sort of an overarching like thing that is very present in how the game is played. And the other thing that I really loved was something we talked about with Dusty, that is about how character creation is also like world creation and that kind of thing.
Ooh, yes, that's absolutely.
Yeah, that different factions have different like authorship over specific things. Like if you're doing character creation for sort of like the engineers, the technical team, you're also defining what the planet is that you're even on.
And the space crew is defining like elements of the astronaut, I think, and the mission and stuff like that.
Mostly resources that they were leaving behind, sort of thing. Like calling on how in the movie certain things were only possible because somebody, left their cross behind or left their specific book behind, and that kind of thing. Just sort of like in the process of character creation and the first round or two of gameplay, whatever it is, doing a lot of the setup that will make your problems more interesting and more specific and give them more texture later.
Yes.
Like not just saying someone's on Mars, okay, there's going to be a dust storm, but saying, okay, the planet that we built is Dusty Hill, who we talked about this with, is very dry and deserty, or it's very swampy, and just like making sure to all have very solid ground that you're working towards and from, to know what the problems are and goofy ways that you can bend that to solve it. Like knowing, okay, we're on a swamp planet. Well, here's some jargon about how you can use the acidity of a bog to do something really important and that sort of thing.
And there's a ton of fruitful meaning making to get out of that.
Yeah. And so there are a lot of sort of like different open questions and places where this game could go in a lot of directions or be a lot of different games. One of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is a structural thing that came up when we were talking with Caleb, that is about like the faction turns being a whole session versus a session being several faction turns.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that is a interesting choice. I'm very drawn to the whole session faction turn because I love the idea of that amount of separation and just like knowing this week we're going to get together and do the tech crew gameplay and that kind of thing. That sounds really fun and satisfying to me. The other thing that I think I want to note that came up a little bit less frequently as we kept sort of iterating is communication control.
Yeah, that was a really interesting thing we talked about with Caleb. Yeah, like what you can pass off between groups or other forms of even in meeting, who can talk or in what order.
And also just stuff like having sort of a move where you act something out with a common object, and then whatever plan gets explained back to you is the plan, and that sort of thing. And I think that one of the versions of this game we can also talk about that is so different is entirely text-based.
Yes.
It is built for play-by-post. It is rotating around the text conversation that the trapped Mars astronaut is having with home base and that kind of thing. There's something really interesting there.
I think both of the things that you mentioned there are both the, like, is it a whole session, and also, like, communication restrictions within, like, how you're working out something, really point to how much open space there is in the broader structure of the game. Feels really clear at this point, as far as just, like, pretty similar between everyone we talk to. But, like, what you do in a faction meeting is so open. And we've, like, suggested different details, but I feel like there's just, like, a lot of expressive room left in how you implement that. Like, there's a vision of faction meetings that are, like, so that you can fit them all in a session. They're fast and quick, and you have your personal projects, and you roll some dice, and you figure out what those mean and what you need from the other people. But then there's also the versions where you're, like, playing out these really full scenes. And I know we talked about, like, there was even, like, a discussion where that was kind of asymmetric, where the spaceship crew had a lot more, like, hopping into in-character moments where you're discussing things than the other factions did. And then there's what you're talking about, where, like, every faction has these huge bespoke communication mechanics, and it takes up a whole session to go through their stuff, and it just feels like there's a lot of room left there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I've thought about it a little differently, which is that for me, my vision of when bespoke communication methods would be implemented is actually in the sort of interfaction.
Oh, like the reconciliation.
Meetings.
Interesting.
Because I think that is more interesting to me, because letting people who are all have the same expertise, who have the same job, they can communicate with each other. They know they have the same language,
they speak
right?
the same language. Ooh, that's a great point.
But then bringing a little bit of extra, like, difficulty into the factional meetings by saying, like, you are only allowed to communicate your plan in very specific ways, that is really interesting to me.
And you're right that those moments of, like, metaphorizing and stuff like that most commonly happen when you've got, like, a guest from another type of team. Like, we've got Rich Purnell from Astrodynamics here to run a stapler around the room.
Yes, exactly.
That gives me a question that I'm curious, like, if you have thoughts on, which is just, like, if we're doing full session faction turns, what do you envision those consisting of? Do you, not even saying there has to be something there already, I'm just curious if you have a vision of, like, what you're doing in those moments.
I think that there's a lot of role play for everybody.
Yeah, totally.
But also, like, everybody has their own personal agenda and that kind of thing, right? And you're coming together to make a plan to present at the meeting.
Yes.
And you probably have a problem that you're working on, and so everyone's just sort of, like, battling out, like, okay, I have my personal agenda that I have in this moment, and then we're also trying to have something that we can put forward as a team. I'm not sure how much more there needs to be there, maybe.
Totally. It also depends on, like, how much we're envisioning for. There's a lot of details around, like, how long is a session and all of that stuff that, like.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I have become a big proponent of, like, hard cap at 3 hours.
Yeah.
So I guess that's probably that's just something that I'm bringing in here. Well, that's another thing to me, is just, like, it's okay if sessions are different lengths.
Like, how much
it's okay if, like,
is your group really in a scene? Cool, keep going. If not, this is a fast one.
You can get together for an hour and a half to do something if you want to. That's totally fine. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
So that kind of thing doesn't worry me as much, I think, because I have a pretty, like, flexible, well, that's up to you.
Yeah.
That's not in my control as a designer. That is something that you will figure out at your table.
Whereas, as you well know, I'm always trying to tightly constrain game experiences.
Yeah, and I think that have given up on that for multiple reasons, one of which the number of one shots that I have played over the course of 3 several hour sessions, like games that are designed to be one shots, you know, I no longer think that it is strictly useful or possible to try and do a lot of like managing of people's time unless you're delivering a very specific experience, like this is a 1 hour game.
Yeah, game that is like on a running stopwatch.
Yeah, and then you have to sort of like bend towards that in your design. It's not something that I find often can just be something you add on top of things.
Yes. You're either designing for that or you're designing for ideas which can be played in a flexible way.
Yeah. So I think the thing that I have the least understanding of is project dice.
Yeah, absolutely.
As a concept. I think one of the things here is that I really liked this is sort of a natural thing that happens in a lot of our conversations, you and I lean towards something that's a little more narrative and flexible, and you lean towards wanting to put a lot of mechanical restrictions on things. And of course those things can combine, and usually do. Most people who think those are completely separate are simply wrong about what both of those things are.
Yeah.
But like, it is true that it's a balancing thing. And so my ideal version of this game, I think, would mostly lean a little bit more flexible, a little bit more narrative. That's one of the reasons that I loved the idea that we came to in the second episode with Dusty about using percentages for numbers, not saying like a certain number of days, but saying you lose half your days, you gain 10% of the days, that kind of thing. Because one of the things that does is just like, you don't have to be as focused on making the math of certain things work. And I find that very appealing. And the project dice, I am curious about how they integrate into all of that. I think that's one of the sort of biggest open questions to me is, if these project dice are here and they're moving around, when and how? What does that mean? I wrote out a document with a few open questions and just sort of like the outline of what we've talked about in the 3 episodes so far. Probably throw that up on Patreon. And that's a big one, the sort of movement of project dice. I think another big open question is, how does this game end? And one thing that I forgot to mention that I also really loved from the Dusty episode specifically was the integration of tarot into the oracle for the astronaut that's stuck on Mars, because I think that is just a perfect system for making that work. But that does mean potentially thinking about like what those prompts are, and that kind of thing, like what the things that the astronaut is doing, what those are based off of. Which reminds me, a detail that we also sort of like moved away from that I'm really curious to talk about is from the very first episode. We set up with Caleb sort of the idea of having these diametrically opposed unmovable objects, immovable objects, which is the astronaut who is always right.
Yeah.
And the director who is always wrong. Except sometimes there is the concept of like, okay, you get 3 per game. 3 times per game the director can be correct. If you present a plan and the director agrees with you, usually that's a bad sign. Usually that means, oops, the universe just told you that plan isn't going to work. But 3 times per game, you can make it work. And I don't think that has to be built in here, but I am very curious to think about ways that can be integrated again, because especially as we continue to build systems that are about like sliders moving back and forth and that kind of thing, it's a very similar setup where you're trying to stay in between but closer to the astronaut, right? And yeah, I just think that's worth sort of having top of mind as we talk about all of this stuff.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of possibilities for how, in thinking of details, those things can like integrate with each other.
Yeah. It sounded like you were most interested in talking about project dice, though. So do you want to go ahead with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there are ways that those other things you're talking about end up joining together. I had initially been a little hesitant about getting too nitty gritty with Project Dice just because of the things we discussed in the first couple episodes. And I feel like Kendo brought us to some really elegant, like, possible answers to this. And part of how that works, and I'm interested in revisiting some of the stuff you said about, like, percentages and Dusty, and hearing about how some of this stuff feels to you, because one of the things that Kendo really brought us to that I thought was great is the idea of sliders having very simple states that always reset. It's just good, neutral, and bad. And so we don't have to be tracking, like, these huge different numbers that are changing and starting in different initial places. And the only consequences of good and bad are little narrative tags at the end. And one of the big unknowns when we talked about sliders, and this is going to get back to Project Dice, is there's still this central element of time, of how fast can we get the astronaut back, and how do we allocate those blocks of time, which is something we talked a lot about with Caleb as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I think something I suggested in the Kendo episode was the idea that time is also a slider. It's just the only slider with a few more notches. And so instead of just good and bad, we have terrible, bad, neutral, good, great, or something like that. Mm-hmm. And so it keeps a really similar structure. But what that allows us to do is, like, you're all jiggling your individual sliders, but in the end, the thing that everyone has to do is either make that slider better, or we all kind of failed in that we brought the astronaut home really sick. Not failed, but, like, that is the collective consequence and what we're all sort of negotiating around. Like, when we talked with Caleb, we talked a lot about, like, we've got 32 days and it's going to take 5 days to put a name on the rocket. Mm-hmm. And how do we negotiate allocation of those days? And when we simplify it to sliders in the way we did with Kendo, we get a little bit more of our time is in a bad place. If we're willing to accept budget bad, we can move time, we can move getting the astronaut home faster up to neutral. And so we take a personal consequence, but collectively our success is better. Are we willing to take those consequences? And also, like, who makes the decision about which one we do? You go to the reconciliation meeting and you have to, like, negotiate that. And where, to me, Project Dice come in is adding a little bit of uncertainty to this process in a way that I like. And I can say how in just a second, but just talking about why first is that, like, right now, if you can always just choose to, like, move your slider up and down in order to move the time slider up and down, there is the sort of social uncertainty of, like, the people who make it to the interfaction meeting, whose sacrifices do they accept, whose choices to leave their personal agendas in the good state do they accept. But, like, if everybody's got a few sliders they can sacrifice, and time is a very small band, it's very easy to accomplish the goal, just mechanically, and it is sort of pure human decision in a way that I think I would find it fun and satisfying for there just to be a little more uncertainty of dice are also feeding us what is possible, and then we are using these personal sacrifices, or personal selfishness, to address this uncertainty. And what do I mean by that? Is, like, a very simple mechanic of everyone rolls a d6, and that is what they are able to do this round. And they also, for their personal project, they need a certain number. They need a 5. And someone else on the crew can give you their 5. We talked about this with Kendo. And that even gives us narrative of the botanist on the space crew actually can help the chemist by growing a certain plant or whatever. And you can pass those numbers around in your crew really easily. And if you're able to just solve things on your own, you might not have to make as many sacrifices to keep your like faction agenda and faction sliders and contributions in a good state. But if your crew can't do it on their own, which probability wise will happen a decent amount of the time, you might need a 5 from the engineers who can like give you a plan. And so when you send your representative to the faction meeting, they go, I know you've got that 5 over there. Can you give that to me? And the agency goes, I need the 5 from the engineers, or we're going to have this giant PR blowback. And at the end of that meeting, you've got to decide who gets the 5, so who takes the bad. And so the choice of like who doesn't get their project done is not just, okay, I'm going to pick either you or you. And even if it was just that, we would need a way to decide, like, does everyone default to bad? What are we allocating? What do those decisions mean? But if we have these very simple dice mechanics that we talked a bit about with Kendo, then we get to say our inputs are these rolls everyone did, and then whoever doesn't get their numbers, they lose the musical chairs of all of this, and their sliders end up in this poor place. There was a bunch of additional conversation with Kendo about ways you could complicate this and make this finickier in ways that I don't think are strictly necessary. For example, making there be a resource cost to passing it between factions. So like you have to worsen a slider if you are giving a die across factions, or like you can worsen a resource slider to change the die result by 1 or whatever. And like that's a place I feel like there's expressive room for people who did want to make it way finickier. But for me, a really simplified version of Project Dice is just, you roll 1 die, you need 1 number, which is maybe you roll 2 dice, the one you did and the one you need. And then you can do it with your own crew, no problem. If you don't finish your project, you end up in a bad state for your faction agenda of some kind. And then there's a little more of questions about like, what's the relationship between faction agendas and personal agendas in those sliders? And then completing projects moves that time slider to being better. And so you're trying to complete your projects while making the minimal personal sacrifices. And when you don't have resources, you have to go to that interfaction meeting and like dole them out. There probably are versions of this game that don't delve into any of that. And like I said, there's ways to really complicate those systems that I don't think are strictly necessary. I'm curious your thoughts on all this. And I'm also curious to hear, like, in a system where we don't have Project Dice, I would love to hear your thoughts on how and why do sliders move.
Well, so, I mean, the question itself is kind of making some assumptions, which is that the sliders and the Project Dice, to my memory, I don't remember the Kendo episode as well because I just edited the other 2, so they're much more fresh in my mind. But, like, they entered the scene at essentially the same time. Like, the sliders didn't exist until episode 3. The Project Dice didn't really exist in a concrete way until episode 3. And so I don't know that I have a vision of what one is without the other, because neither of them is a concrete assumption that I have made about how this game works, if that makes sense. So I probably don't have an answer to that.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think it's very clear that I felt very excited about the sort of slider conversations with Kendo. So it does make sense that I'm treating that as a little more of an assumption and thinking kind of linearly in the development of this.
I mean, I like the slider idea, and I specifically like the idea of the taking a tag to put the slider to neutral kind of thing. I think that probably one of the things that would be important to explore here would be limitations on numbers of tags. That would also be a way to make sure that people can't just always do a bad thing. Like, be like, you can have 3 tags. That's it, kind of thing, you know? So, like, you can't just do it all of the time. You have to balance. And I think that the one that I find the most difficult to wrap my head around is the time slider, in part because when does the game end?
Yes. I'm realizing I had thoughts on that I like didn't fully explain. Which is we talked a little bit, I think in multiple conversations about milestoning it. that time is not one thing from the moment you discover the Martian is still there to when they come home, but rather in the movie, it's 200 days until the probe. Okay, it's 150 days until they loop around the Earth. And we've got these intermittent ones. And to me, the time slider works similarly to all of the other ones in the ways it resets at these milestones, and then the astronaut takes tags. And I'm realizing we didn't talk about this in a way that is assumptions in my head, where like the time slider, if it's like 5 or even 6 or 7 long, and it usually starts in a really bad place, unlike everyone else's that starts in neutral. And for every failure to get the time slider to neutral or better during a given cycle, the astronaut takes a negative tag of some kind. Because Mark Watney also ends up in bad states during the process because, like, their probe to get him more food doesn't get there in time. And so you can address the Martian can have problems, the astronaut can have problems, and have those problems addressed if, in a given cycle, you get to positive on this slider and you get to cancel one of their negative tags. The same way is true for everyone else. And so in my imagination of that, the way the length of the game works is literally just a set number of cycles. It's just like, we will play 5 cycles, and on a given cycle, the time slider is kind of just a success slider. And the longer this cycle takes, the more negative tags the Martian takes. And then the next cycle, if you can get it to positive, you can start canceling out the malnourished or the injured or the going crazy, like, tags that they built up because you left them there for 300 days without a probe last time. Mm-hmm. And there's also room for bringing in some of the astronaut tarot and stuff here, where, like, how negative on the time slider they start depends on the input from an astronaut poll, and then you also interpret what that actually, like, narratively means for their situation. Or it just could be static. You start at the worst part on the time slider every time and get it up as much as you can. But the idea in my head was just a set number of cycles. Each cycle, if you fail to get the time slider up enough, they take negative tags. If you get it really good, you cancel negative tags.
Yeah, I think the element that I'm a little sad to lose with all of this is the thing about it being a movie about saying numbers out loud.
Yeah, totally.
And so one of the things that I would be curious about is having some sort of number of days, like still having time units and then also having the sliders. Because one of the things is, like, those are actually separate things. There is a point at which in the movie he has enough food to survive for 900 days. And so the length of time is actually very long, but the status is good.
Yeah, totally.
And so I would be curious about a system that sort of has both of those things. And so there is still that element of, like, losing and gaining days and bargaining for days and that kind of thing. And yeah, just that it has both, I think, could be interesting.
Yeah, and I think that's totally doable. And I then have a couple mechanical questions to flip back at you, because in some ways, to me, it's more mechanically complicated to do it that way, but not in a way that I shy away from, not in a way that I found it, like, simpler, but that doesn't mean better. And I'm curious, I want to almost, like, pitch you a couple different ways that I would be thinking about it if we've got, like, this number of days element, and see which ones excite you the most. And so there's a version where time left on the mission is not milestoned. There is just a number of days left, and it determines the length of play, and that means play could be really variable, because when you solve problems, you reduce the number of days, you add the number of days, and when you get to 0 days, you're done. And when you want to put your face on the rocket, it extends the length of the campaign that you play. Or it is milestoned, and it's like, this cycle has 200 days. How many of them do we spend doing our personal agenda, and how many do we spend putting the Martian in a better position? And the faster we do it, the better the Martian's final state ends up. Or we even really expand it more, and there's like the Martian, and I think we did mention this in at least one episode, the Martian has a health slider, and they have a like mental status slider, and you have to manage those in addition to units of time. Or even you're managing units of time, and if you're ever in the sort of negative, those sliders start taking hits until you get it back positive. And that's like, to me, it changes the meaning of time from how long until they come home to how long until the next urgent problem. Because that kind of comes up in the movie where it's like, we thought we had 300 days because he had all this food. Then he lost all this food. So now we have to figure out how to do the other thing faster because that clock just got much less. And so it's not time until they come home, but time until next urgent problem that has to be overcome.
Well, it's time until he dies.
Yeah, I guess fundamentally. And then that can just be driven by different things.
Wait, what do you mean?
Time until he dies can be food. Time until he dies can be injury. Time until he dies can be oxygen.
Yeah. I think like the integration that first came to my mind is actually like not that complex because it means that the units of time are applied a little bit more narratively, I guess. That like it could be something about like, okay, well, we know that we have 5 days and that this will be a really good thing, and so we found a solution to a problem that is like very fast and very helpful. What is it? You know, it's sort of like there's a version of it that is just about pushing people to come up with different types of solutions to different problems. Like we have enough time, and so we can send the 200-day refuel rocket. And then we don't have enough time, so we need to find a solution that fits in this 5 days. And that could be discovering a stash of snacks that somebody left behind and that kind of thing. I don't know. That I just think there are a lot of different possibilities, and that's just how I was thinking about it potentially.
Is it like in that version, the outcome is kind of set, and then as players you're explaining it? Like, we will do this in a certain number of days. How?
I don't know. I think that it's not something that I'm super invested in, so I don't feel the need to sort of explore and explain it more. But yeah.
Yes, totally.
One of the questions I have with sort of like projects as you stated them is every project just one die, or can projects take multiple rounds and you need to have multiple dice and that sort of thing?
Yeah, I think you actually brought that up in the Kendo episode too. And absolutely, like, one way you could go about this is the idea that like there's this really longer term multi-step effort. And again, what the sort of mechanical outcome of that means depends on how or if the game is tracking objectives like time and stuff like that. But I don't see a reason why like there couldn't have that be the case. And I think it adds interesting narrative to say like, I'm imagining someone coming to the interfaction meeting and being like, I've been trying to do this for a half a year or for the last 300 days. Can someone finally just help me get this done? Can someone, in the mechanical terms, can someone just give me 2 more 5s, please? I'm really delighted by the vibe that brings. And so it sort of depends on just like, do we want to add more ongoing sort of state in mechanical terms to the game? But I don't see a reason why not. I don't actually think that would add that much complication to add.
Yeah, I think there would have to be, just because like it wouldn't make a lot of sense for everybody to have projects that are all taking the same amount of time when they're all working on such different things.
Yeah, totally.
And I think that there is a potential here for like the projects to be sort of like more of what the arc of the game hinges on, rather than saying you're going to do 5 sessions, saying that like you have to start. There are project difficulties of various project difficulties, and you have to start an impossible project to get the astronaut home, and that involves like you're going to have to do 10 faction level projects, and the dice for faction level projects can only come from successfully completed personal projects. And so like have it sort of filter up.
I love that.
The idea that like it takes 20 dice to make the 5 dice that get the astronaut home, but scaling it a lot more dramatically.
Yeah.
And I think like in order for it to be satisfying, the tags and the project dice definitely have to be more mechanically linked, even if it's very simple. Like you can push your slider down to re-roll a die or something like that, you know? And in tandem with limitations on how many tags you can have. But I think like there's a version of this game that just has the sliders, and it is a purely narrative experience. And I think that there are people who would be satisfied by that. I'm one of them.
Yeah.
Like where the game is just like get together and with your friends figure out a way to balance which one of you is going to take a negative consequence and which are not, and that sort of thing. That could be really fun for me. And then I think if the project dice are in there, which I think are also really cool, I'm sure this came up in the episode and I'm just not remembering, Citizen Sleeper.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. Oh, 100%. That was the reference point, the initial reference point for this.
And if that's the case, then the sliders, if they are, there is also a version of this where the sliders aren't a thing at all and it's just project dice.
Yeah, totally.
And then you're figuring out other ways to put limitations on that and say like, here's how many dice you can roll per turn or per round. Here's why. Here's how you can re-roll them. Here's how you can move them around. You need to... It could even be like a stacking thing where we talked about the idea of like, even just being able to communicate with the astronaut is a project.
Yeah.
You have to set something up, and at that point you can start influencing what they get up to. That actually is, I think, my main question with the idea of the game as we've sort of like talked about it, the game that sort of got like worked towards, if we're considering this a linear conversation of like start to finish, the game that we ended up with, quote unquote, at the very end. What is up with the astronaut during all of that? Like, what information are we getting from the astronaut? How are we influencing what they do? That sort of thing. Because I think when we were talking about it in sort of the like, you are receiving inputs from the astronaut and then responding to them, I understood much better where the characterization of the astronaut and what they're up to came from. I don't see where the room is for that in this version, which is not to say it doesn't exist, just that I currently don't understand where it is.
Absolutely.
Do you have an idea of that?
Yeah, totally. In how I was imagining some of the project like stuff, in each sort of cycle of meetings, the dilemma to me dilemmas came from the astronaut, where at the start of a cycle you do sort of oracle pulls for the astronaut, and it's like, okay, so we found out there's a big dust storm coming, and also all the potatoes just went bad.
Mm-hmm.
And so everybody, you're rolling your dice to see like what numbers you need, but what does it mean to get or not get those numbers? Those are projects that help solve the astronaut's problem, and you use what you've created about your character to figure out why those help with that problem. And so if you're a rocket scientist, you're like, okay, I think I can repurpose this thing to lift off this much faster so we can resupply them on food. And if you're space crew, you're like, okay, I left behind this wooden cross, and I think I can figure out how I could burn that. I could instruct the astronaut to burn that for fuel to start growing again. Or if you're the agency, your project is actually like, we need enough budget to do all of these different things so that the engineers can do their stuff. So I'm going to be working on securing them the budget for their solutions. And so the astronaut inputs in a narrative way what the dilemmas are. Dust storm, potatoes running out, etc., etc. And then everybody else narrativizes the projects they are doing to address the problems that are getting input from the astronaut each cycle.
Yeah, I think that I would probably love a version of that where it is unpredictable when those things are going to arrive. It isn't just like once per round. It's like a dice roll that you do at the start of every session or something like that.
Interesting.
That like is probably weighted in some way, just because that is like, that feels important to the unpredictability of when something. And also I think that that means that they're either a mechanic for abandoning projects, I think, is interesting. And I think that there are two sort of ways to think about that. It could be that you have to do something to abandon a project if, like, let's say a crisis occurs randomly. There's also a version where it is a retroactive justification. You are forced to abandon a project, and when you do that, you go, okay, what in the circumstance changed that made this no longer like a viable solution to whatever we were working on, which is the kind of thing where it's like, I was working on this project to send you a bunch of food. I'm being forced to abandon that project because of, 2 rounds passed without me adding another die to it. It could be something like the rocket blew up, but it could also be something like, oh, us sending you that supply of food was only possible on the assumption you would be able to survive long enough to get it. I'm abandoning this project. This means we have just learned you're not going to make it that long. Yeah. And I think, like, yeah, that's interesting to me. I think probably that is something that is really easy to tie into sort of agendas and consequences. Like, if ground control or whoever wants to abandon a project, that's putting a lot of pressure on their budget. Yeah. And that kind of thing. Or just public opinion being like, why did you spend so much time on that thing that ultimately didn't work? There's a lot of cool stuff that I think could be in there. And one of the things I would love to bring in here that I think is very actually easy and possible is the concept that we talked about early on of getting some characterization from the astronaut by contrasting events that are happening to them with sort of like journal entries,
little journal
that
entries
we receive from them.
That were totally random. I loved that.
Yeah. I would love to see the element of that. I think that I do struggle with the you're going to play 5 rounds thing. I don't think that it's impossible for that to be satisfying, considering just there's so much of the like, there's so much flexibility and grabbing time back and spending time in the concept that part of me sort of just like chafes against it as something, but it isn't something that I'm opposed to entirely. I think that I just personally, if I were like sitting down to design this, would want to give a really deliberate eye to what that is serving.
All the things you said there, I feel really excited about an idea that I feel like addresses a lot of those things at once, like one possible answer. That also even goes back to something you said earlier, which is that like if there's going to be these project dice, they should also probably like play into the tag should have a little more mechanical weight to them, if that's going to be such a focus of the game, because one of the inspiring mechanics for the tags was the Quiet Years scarcities, just a list of things that are scarce. Mm-hmm. And what if, beginning of a session, you roll and you might get 1 or more astronaut problems? I'm imagining a running list of astronaut problems. Like, you get a new problem on there. You get food, you get water, you get health, you get dust storm. And then when you start a project, you're solving that scarcity. I think this is literally Quiet Year. The more I think about it, Project Dice literally solve scarcities. Yeah. And then someone else might solve that scarcity first. If someone else
I think that scarcities in Quiet Year can only be fixed if you're prompted to. Like, you could do a project. If you have a scarcity of food, you can say, well, I'm going to build a farm. And that farm does exist, but you do still have a scarcity of food unless you are directly prompted. Because I think that you can't just solve all of your problems by saying, I'm going to solve these problems. I think that the problems exist unless the prompt says, solve a scarcity or something like that.
I couldn't remember if completing a project could remove a scarcity. I thought that maybe it could when you count down a die.
Think so, and I might be misremembering. I might be misattributing to. There are certainly prompts that are like add a scarcity or add an abundance and that kind of thing, but because I think that is the case, that you can't just decide to fix all of your scarcities and then have that just be true. That isn't super important, just, yes.
Regardless of how it works in the quiet year, I was thinking of the idea that a project can directly, like, fix the food problem that got introduced, but if someone else fixes that problem first, well, now you don't even need to do your project anymore. Or maybe there are random events that solve it, or, like, in negotiation, someone's like, I want to do my solution. And going one step further, you mentioned this idea of, like, to bring the astronaut home, you need, like, 20 successes, like a faction level or something. What if at the beginning of the game, you start with a huge pile of problems that all have to be solved through a similar structure before you can bring the astronaut home? And that also provides a variable time element. So, like, in the same way you have a list of negative tags or a list of scarcities or whatever, you've got, like, return trip, retrieval in atmosphere, because they have to, like, pull him over to the ship, landing, re-entry. It's just this list of, like, 20 things that, like, you have to solve all of these for the astronaut to get home. And you can do projects which check an item off that list. And you've got to get that list to 0. And so however long it takes you to check off all those items is how long the game is going to last. But then new things are either getting added to that list or a more, like, urgent list of negative tags that's like a starving, dust storm, whatever. And so you have to fix those tags before you can work on long-term projects. And that sort of brings those systems into parity in a way that I find really elegant and achieves a variable length game that has a lot of narrative weight to why these tags are there, because projects are solving specific tags.
Sure. Yeah. That all sounds very possible.
Yeah.
I think my final big question for all of this is what this version looks like when it comes to working towards this epilogue. Because, of course, there's a version of this game where that is no longer a focus. But I thought that was really compelling. And we talked a lot about, like, controlling what the record of this game can even be. If you don't do your personal project, no one even remembers that you were part of this. That kind of thing. And there was an element of the story that is not told in the story you tell, like saying, yeah, this person was married for 70 years, and not mentioning that they nearly got divorced when they had to spend an extra 4 years in space unexpectedly and that sort of thing. One thing that I think would probably make sense to sort of pull into that is the idea of, even if you don't track what negative and positive tags you had, like you don't write down stress marriage a bunch of times, tracking at least the numbers of how frequently you gain a negative tag or gain a positive tag, and then those numbers tying into the epilogue, similarly to that fiasco style we've talked about, where, you know, it becomes a threshold thing where in fiasco it actually is literally almost the exact same thing. It is how many positive endings, at least in Fiasco Classic style. I'm sorry, I don't know how the card one works. I may never. I have played it once, but Fiasco Classic is just one of the best games of all time to me, so I'm very loyal to it. But in Fiasco Classic, you are literally tracking with dice, 2 different colors of dice, how many positive endings to scenes there were and how many negative endings to scenes there were. It's not quite 1-to-1, because in Fiasco you can give each other dice So it isn't literally about endings your character had, because it could be a scene you weren't even in. But it is very similar. And so I think that there is a possibility there of like different thresholds of like, okay, so you had 25 negative tags over the course of the game and 4 positive tags. History is going to remember that this project succeeded, but you lost everything. You were fired, you got divorced. It became very clear that you were, whether this is true, whether you were actually embezzling, that's what the history books say.
Oh my God.
You know, that kind of thing. And I think like, I'm not sure, there are a lot of different ways that this could work, but I think in some ways this is disconnected from what this game has become. And so it might not fit naturally, but I think there is a version where it fits, and that's probably how I'd tie it in. And I think the other thing that I would tie it to is the communication limitations during interfactional meetings. Ooh. Somehow thematically tie that to like, this is about the ways that stories are told. This is about the fact that it matters who tells stories. Like the tech team coming, if they're only allowed to do charades to communicate their plans, that is very different than if somebody who is only allowed to write stuff down comes to share a plan. It's very different from somebody who is only allowed to bring a pre-recorded video and do no follow-up questions or something like that, right? Like tying it to the fact that the delivery of a story matters, who delivers a story matters, probably having elements of like, what even is the final document? Is it an obituary? Is it the sidebar summary of your Wikipedia article? You know, and possibly having that be tied to which faction the character was in and that kind of thing. There's a lot of different elements there that I think like it would take some careful integration with the rest of the systems to make sure that it didn't just feel like it was coming out of nowhere. I don't think it's impossible, and I think it is interesting. It's also maybe different games, which is one of the things that I kind of love about this whole setup, is that we can talk about different, like completely different games that are technically coming from the same thing. And that's why we've had this conversation that I do not sort the conversations we have in a linear fashion, in part because it is so fascinating to me to be able to keep dipping back into
all
different
the different
episodes and being like,
produces.
What was this game at this point? And it is cool to like look at it linearly and be like, here we developed to this, but it's also really fun to be able to be like, okay, but wait, go back in the edit history, in the document history.
Yeah.
Like go back to the one that was, I even in the notes that I took to just so that we could like be on the same page about everything we've talked about, there's a tab that is after episode 1, and there's a tab that is after episode 3, because the game was in a very different state after those episodes. And I think that's cool. And that's one of the reasons I've really, this is sort of getting into like statement of intent, but I really want to be able to capture some of that in these episodes where we don't just say like, here is the game we work towards. We're also allowed to just bounce around and be like, okay, but what about the game that we were working towards?
Absolutely.
Here, you know, and just sort of provide those things, and anybody who's listening can go, I liked that one. I'm going to take that seed. That's the one I'm going to water. I'm going to play with that and that sort of thing.
I also felt so inspired, like speaking of different game ideas, I felt so inspired by some of the stuff you were pointing towards there. Like a couple different sort of mutually exclusive ways of thinking about how this epilogue is constructed. Because now I'm thinking about like, what if the space agency team has outsized influence on the epilogue? Their projects have the ability to influence how the history gets told more than other people's do, in a way that's interesting to me. Or another version, maybe not mutually exclusive, but easier if they were, who gets to go to the interfaction meetings means you have more influence over how the history gets told. Like if you're picked to be at the meeting, it could even literally be like at the end, you're all going to get together and write this epilogue, and your character gets a number of sentences of 1 plus the number of interfaction meetings that you got to be at.
I think there's also something that I remember Caleb bringing up that I loved, that one of the ways that it gets integrated is just reminding people of it narratively, that like there is a Caleb had this great example that is like one of the random engineers basically being like, why should I sacrifice my personal agenda for anybody who's in the spaceship? Every single person there is guaranteed to be the most famous person in their field when they get home, and they will be forever. Maybe they should have to sacrifice something instead of me because I don't have that guarantee in my future, and that kind of thing.
That also makes me think about like sort of milestoning elements of the epilogue. Like, this continues to be going very far afield, but like, what if there's a round after the interfaction meeting that is a press conference, which is something we've talked about, and a little bit of the history gets captured at that press conference, and then that's happening every sort of cycle, and like there's still going to be like the much bigger bulk of it is at the end, but like in order to keep players focused on and how does this create legacy and what is remembered, they actually get to see a little bit of who gets to go to the press conference, who gets to present at the press conference, what do the media ask about, like every time around this loop. And again, that's kind of a whole new element, but I think it is an interesting way to get at that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there are just there's so many different sort of like directions to go from here. Of course, there is apparently a mandatory element. Of course, there's the mega game version of this, but the one I'm honestly so compelled by is I did say there's the play-by-post version, you know, where it is about just the astronaut texting ground control. More interesting than that to me is an asymmetric. What I'm learning is that I have a cliche idea that is not a cliche idea for almost anyone else, which is asymmetric play-by-post. It's like one of the defaults that I come to, but like
I think I see where you're going, and I'm so excited about it.
Yeah, it's more of like, it's a more direct isolation simulator, right? It is the astronaut being a lone player and only receiving updates through text, only being able to communicate through text, and then people on the other side, either in person or they're on a call is also possible. People being on a call and talking through. Oh, there's a billion Zoom meetings in this movie. So I bet that's what it actually is that there are breakout rooms that people are having conversations in, and then they're coming together, telling the plan. The astronaut is basically playing a solo game where they're just like working through their day and occasionally reporting a crisis and then getting solutions back and trying to fix stuff together with genuinely for safety reasons. There's also a version of this game where there's two people on the planet, like or a team on the planet.
They're not feeling so genuinely isolated.
I think that could be really cool, but literally for actual safety reasons, I think
emotional well-being. Like,
yes, having it be something where like, well, you can have your little isolated crew and you're all working together, kind of thing.
And like, as soon as you started saying this, I was envisioning the idea of like individual factions are co-located and doing these live sessions, and then passing bits of information via text, and then the interfaction meeting is a Zoom call. And so you have these pockets of people getting together in different places, because we see this happen in the movie, and then you are actually picking a person to go to that meeting, and then that meeting is actually negotiating who gets to talk, and like what information does get passed on or just doesn't is really, the players don't have perfect knowledge of what's going on in those individual meetings is so interesting to me.
Yeah, the only flexibility that I personally would want to build in there is that like, I like the idea that sometimes the tech team can be in different parts of the world and they are calling each other, right? Or you can have somebody from NASA go and visit one of the tech teams and that kind of thing. So like, that's why I was thinking sort of like breakout rooms that
absolutely
could symbolize different physical locations, or they could actually symbolize a call. Just having a little bit of flexibility there is interesting to me, because that automatically means you're going to be doing some weird social politicking for who is where and when, which absolutely. I think is good.
Ugh, games.
Yeah, I think that we've probably pretty much covered everything that we need to here. We have this weird the most developed idea that we have is this factional gameplay with projects and sliders and taking tags and trying to bring this astronaut home. We also talked a lot about just versions that are much more number based, much more narrative based. There's a lot of different ground that this could cover. There's a lot of different mechanical spaces that this could land in, and I think that's really cool. There are obviously like so many open questions. There's so many different sort of design iterations that can happen in all of these things. Even in the more defined structure that we have, there are 1,000 decisions that could be made that would turn it into 1,000 different games, because that's how games are, which is great. So I would truly invite people to think about this. Think about what the game is that you would make that is tied to any of these concepts. What are the games that you think are doing similar things? Let us know about them. Let us know your thoughts. Join the Discord, hit us up on Bluesky, whatever. You can check out the Patreon, where we'll probably just toss some notes and sort of the outline that I developed of like, here's where I think this game is at right now and that sort of thing. And other than that, I think that's that. I think that is that. Jess, what would you like to point people towards?
Yeah, you can find me online as jessfrom.online, and you can find me as Jumpgate Games pretty much anywhere that you get games. And I think that's pretty much it. You've heard about my games a couple times now throughout this series. If you enjoyed this series, many of the people involved with it were involved with many other projects I've done. So if you want to hear Kendo and Dusty and Satah, go listen to the Galactic and Going Rogue official actual plays on Party of One and on One Shot Podcast. We're also going to be having someone from One Shot pretty soon. So great time to go check that out. And, if you enjoyed this, there's lots more out there where these people brought the same level of brilliance to it. And I'm lucky enough to say that it was connected to games that I worked on.
Yeah, go check out everything that Caleb, Dusty, and Kendo have done and will do. They are all brilliant, and we are so lucky to have been able to have these conversations with them. I am Satah. You can find me on Bluesky at posatachips.gaygothvibes.online. You can find my website at gaygothvibes.online. You can join the Haunted Table Patreon at Ghost Tier, which is $3 or above, to get the House Edge, which is a Triangle Agency Fist Ultra Edition crossover that we have been working on very hard that is truly a delight. Our next movie is going to be Apollo 13. So if you want to be able to really have intimate knowledge of that, make sure you find some time in the next week or two to watch that, and we will be back turning it into a game, because this, of course, is the show about that moment where you say, this should be a game.
This should be a game.
Follow the show on Bluesky at thissshouldbeaga.me and join our Discord at discord.thissshouldbeaga.me to talk games with us. Support the show financially on Patreon to vote for the genres and movies we cover, send in audio messages for mechanical mailbag episodes, and read the notes we take while watching stuff for the show. Thank you to Cris Viana for the logo and Nicky Flowers for the theme song. Both of them are linked in the show notes, as well as any games we referenced in our discussions.